When my name was Keoko, Chapter 5, Soon-hee. When we chose our new names, I pointed to the letter K. I went around whispering over and over, Keoko, Kaneyama, Keoko, Keoko, Kaneyama. Japanese family names were usually long. Kim, Korean names were short. Keoko, Japanese names, first names could be long or short. Soon-hee, Korean first names were almost always 2 syllables. I had always liked the sound of Japanese first names. Tomo meant friend. I remembered learning that when I was little. It had pleased me so much that my best friend's name was Friend. His sisters were Sachiko and Hiroko. Girls' names often ended in ko, which means girl in Japanese. I liked how Abuji had hidden our real last name in the new one he'd chosen for us, and he'd done the same for my first name as well. Ko meant girl, but it could also mean the sun's rays, rays of brightness, the same meaning as my real name. I could think about Kaneyama Keoko as a name, but not as my name. For the next few days there was terrible confusion at school. We had to learn our classmates' Japanese names and call them by those names. Suddenly, the girl across the aisle from me was Megumi, not Mayunjin. And the boy who sat behind me was Masato instead of Youngwon. In school, when I spoke of my brother, I had to call him Nubuo. Our teacher tried to be patient with us. If we forgot and used our classmates' real names, she prompted us, gently at first, but more sternly as time went on. I was being a good student. I had never once given the teacher cause to beat me. I was very careful to use everyone's Japanese name and to respond when anyone said Keoko, even though it felt as if they were talking to someone else. But on the second day of the name change, my brain grew tired of being careful every single minute, and I called the classmate by her Korean name. I chose the worst possible moment to make this mistake. Onishi-san was in the room. He was the man who served as the military attaché for our school. Our teachers were Korean, but their bosses were Japanese. Onishi-san's job was to make sure all the students were learning to be good citizens of the empire. He came into our classroom several times a week, often in the middle of a lesson. We always stopped what we were doing and bowed to him. Then he'd stand back at the back of the room and observe us for a while. I could tell he made the teacher nervous. I tried especially hard to give the right answers when he was around. That day, I knew he was in the room. I knew I had to be extra careful not to make a mistake, and somehow I did the very thing I was trying so hard not to. I said Mayunjin instead of Megumi. Onishi-san heard me. He made a funny sound in his throat like, ah. Then he looked at the teacher and made an abrupt motion with his stick. The teacher glanced at him quickly and then at me. Keoko, to the front, she said. The class was suddenly silent. I could see the surprise in the faces of the other students. The daughter of the vice principal, who had never before been beaten. In the brief moments it took me to walk to the front of the class, I saw the teacher's face. She looked so unhappy that I felt sorrier for her than for me. She didn't want to beat me, but she had to, because Onishi-san was there. It was so unfair. First our names were taken away, and then we weren't even given even a few days to learn everyone's new names. So when the bamboo cane swished through the air, I was angry, not frightened. With each stinging whack, the words rang in my mind, unfair, 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 unfair. Best of all, I was too angry to cry. At home that night, Omoni pressed her lips together when she saw the fierce red welts on my legs. She soothed them with a paste made of herbs, but the marks stayed there for several days. I was glad they didn't fade right away. Seeing and feeling the red soreness of those welts always made me a little angry all over again. I wanted to stay angry about losing my name. The changing of my name made even Tomo cross. When we played together after school during those early days of the name change, he kept catching himself. Keoko, he said. Once, after correcting himself for what seemed like the 100th time, he stamped his foot in frustration. Keoko, 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 he said, as if trying to pound the name into his brain. Keoko, 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 Keoko. He was getting his tongue all twisted. I giggled. Kikiko, Kikoko, Kiyaku, Koko-ka. Now we were both laughing. Kakuku, Kiaya-ka. Tomo was laughing at the silly sounds. I was laughing for the same reason, but I was also secretly pleased to be treating my Japanese name with such disrespect. At last our laughter faded and we caught our breath. Tomo glanced at me quickly, then looked away again. Maybe, when it's just the two of us alone, I could still call you Sun-Hee. What do you think? It wasn't often that Tomo asked for my opinion. I wanted to answer carefully, so I thought for a moment. Wouldn't that just make it harder, I said. You'd have to switch to my Japanese name when we're with other people. You might get mixed up and forget it. I didn't say all that I was thinking, as the son of the principal, Tomo always had to set an example. A mistake from him would be worse than a mistake from other students. He would lose a lot more face. I didn't have to say it because it was something Tomo lived every day. You're right, he said. He flicked another glance at me. It's such a nuisance, isn't it? And I knew this was his way of saying he was sorry I had to change my name. It was our last year of school together. Elementary students all went to the same school, but in junior high, boys and girls went to separate schools. Not that Tomo and I saw each other much in school anyway. The Japanese students had their own classrooms. Tomo had told me that in bigger cities the Japanese had their own schools, but our town was too small for that. I only saw Tomo at assembly times, which were in the morning when the whole school met in the courtyard to recite the emperor's education policy. We also sang the Japanese national anthem and did exercises together, and once in a while there were special assemblies. Even though I couldn't read Japanese when I first went to school, knowing how to speak it made all the lessons much easier for me. At the start of my second year, I was made class leader because I was the best in my class at reading and writing. We had to learn 3 kinds of writing. 2 kinds used the Japanese alphabet, and there were 2 different alphabets. The third system, which most of my classmates found terribly difficult, was called kanji. Kanji has no alphabet. Instead, each word is a separate picture character. Although there are nearly 50,000 characters, altogether there are nearly 50,000 characters. Not even scholars who spend their whole lives studying kanji can learn them all. We had to learn about 2,000 basic characters to recognize them in reading and to write them ourselves. We had calligraphy lessons as part of studying kanji. I loved calligraphy the first time I tried it. It seemed that an unknown creature came to life in the brush as soon as I picked it up. A creature light as a dragonfly, smooth as a snake, quick as a rabbit. The combinations of kanji characters were like magic to me. For example, the character for love. You wrote the character for mother and combined it with the one for child. When stroked with the brush rather than sketched out with a pencil, the word truly did look more loving. Every week we learned new characters. Sometimes the connections were easy to understand. The character for life was formed by writing water plus tongue, for without water to drink, there could be no life. The characters rice and mouth together made happy or peaceful. It was true. How could you be happy or at peace if you were starving? Kanji was full of secrets like this. Taeyuo hated studying kanji. He thought it was boring. I couldn't understand that at all. Maybe I loved kanji because it was about knowing a little and figuring out the rest. Abuji noticed my interest in kanji and began to spend more time with me. Before, Omoni had always looked after us. Abuji was busy with his own work. Until he started to help me study kanji, I'd spend very little time with him. My lessons in school concentrated on learning and memorizing characters. This was so difficult and took so much time that the teachers didn't explain much about each individual character. Abuji took my learning a step further, or rather, a step backwards. One night we sat together at the low table in his room, bent over a sheet of paper. Mouth, he said as he wrote the character. This is very simple. It began as a circle like an open mouth, but the line was squared to make it easier to combine with other characters. West. The sun goes down, the bird flies back to their nest. So you see, and he drew for me the progression of the pictures that had evolved into the character for West. I loved these sessions with Abuji. I watched with my eyes and listened with my ears and learned with my heart. My kanji got better without it ever feeling like work. At the end of my 4th year of school, I was awarded a special prize for my language skills. All students wore 2 badges on their collars, one with the school's name and the other with their graduation year. I was given a 3rd badge to wear. It meant I was the best in my grade at Japanese. It was the proudest moment of my life when the principal pinned the badge onto my collar in front of the entire school. I didn't look at Abuji, but I could feel how proud he was. As I left the platform to rejoin my class, Tomo smiled at me with his eyes. I was so surprised and pleased that I almost stopped walking. Tomo and I never talked to each other at school. Even when I did see him in the courtyard before school or during assemblies, I pretended I didn't know him, and he did the same with me. It was just the way things were. Japanese and Korean children didn't mix during school. Tomo must have noticed my surprise, for he quickly looked away. But that didn't bother me. Nothing could have bothered me as I walked back to my seat. I felt as if I were floating on a bright, rosy cloud. That afternoon on my way home from school, I felt something whiz past my ear. I turned around quickly, ducking just in time as a second pebble flew past. I kept my head down but glanced wildly around. Who was throwing stones at me? At that moment, a gang of boys from school dashed out from behind a wall. They threw a final volley of pebbles at me, then ran away, chanting, "Chin il pa, Chin il pa." Chin il pa meant lover of Japan. It was almost like a curse. Chin il pa were people who got rich because they cooperated with the Japanese government. I hadn't done anything like that. Why were they cursing me, calling me that awful name? I ran home, blinking away tears. That evening I was distracted during my kanji lessons with Abuji. He was showing me north, 2 men sitting back to back at the top of the world, as I stared not at the paper, but at the shining but new badge on my collar. The badge was the reason those boys had thrown stones at and called me names. I was good at Japanese. They thought that made me Chin il pa. I wasn't a traitor, was I? Could you be a traitor without knowing it? Even to be called one was shameful. Maybe I could take the pin off, but they'd all notice, my teachers, the principal, Abuji, everyone. Then I'd be in trouble at school as well. I tried to make myself laugh inside by recalling Uncle's favorite joke about the Chin il pa. They eat Korean rice, but they poop in Japanese. But not even this cheered me. Suddenly, Abuji put down the pencil and looked at me thoughtfully. You know, Sunhee, kanji was not originally Japanese. Not Japanese? What did he mean? I looked up at him, puzzled. Both Korea and Japan long ago borrowed the system of character writing from China. The Japanese use it in their own way, of course, especially when they combine it with their alphabetic writing. But the characters are the same. This, he picked up the pencil again and pointed to the page, is the character for north in Japanese and in Chinese, and in Korean as well. Abuji stacked the books neatly, rolled up the paper, and put away the inkpot. I stood and bowed to him, preparing to leave the room. He spoke again. Your grandfather was a great scholar. He knew much of the important classical Chinese literature. In his time, and for hundreds of years before his time, we Koreans always considered Chinese the highest form of learning. He paused and looked at me calmly. To excel at character writing is to honor the traditions of our ancestors. I hadn't realized that my worries were showing on my face, but Abuji had noticed. What he'd said was meant to comfort me and make me feel proud inside of myself again. I nodded, hoping he'd understand my silent thanks. If those boys called me Chin il pa again, I could reach inside and hold on to the knowledge he'd given me.